There's nothing really in this statement that tells us anything fresh about the government's approach. So if I may, I'd like to address one particular aspect of the equality and human rights agenda that needs much more focus than it is currently getting, and that aspect is neurodiversity, and in particular the way public services still operate on the assumption that everybody is neurotypical. I believe that this question should be seen as an equalities question. There's increasing recognition that not everyone's brain works in the same way. With new and increasing understanding emerging from neuroscience, it's likely that this understanding will further grow, and all of this then clearly has an impact upon human rights. Now, the arguments around legislation on autism have been rehearsed in this chamber on numerous occasions. We in Plaid Cymru believe that legislation is needed to improve services and to protect the rights of people who are not neurotypical. The government doesn't believe that we should have such legislation. This means that many people on the autism spectrum can wait for years for a diagnosis. It means that there is a near total lack of adult autism support services available, with many people often referred to inappropriate services that regard their neurotype as a mental health condition or a behavioural problem, blocking them from receiving the support that they require. I'd like to highlight two examples of where public bodies are not respecting the rights of non-neurotypical people. A 15-year-old girl on the spectrum in my constituency was referred to CAMHS. After waiting, it was clear that she did not need a CAMHS intervention, but there was little else available. So she has now stopped going to school, she rarely leaves her home, and her mother doesn't know where to turn. Where is the equality for this young woman? A second example is Bridgen's decision to reorganise school transport, which involved changing transport arrangements for pupils on the autism spectrum. The change was communicated poorly, with no consideration that a sudden change of routine is especially stressful and potentially harmful to some children who are on the autism spectrum. So my questions are as follows. Do you, Minister, think that neurodiversity needs to be considered as an equalities issue in its own right, with having non-neurotypical brain becoming a protected characteristic? Do you accept that currently many public services are designed and delivered around the assumption that everyone is neurotypical and therefore fail to take into account the needs of people of a different neurotype? Do you think that the response of public services needs to move beyond treating autism as a medical condition and instead begin to see having a neurologically different brain not as a defect, but rather as a form of neurodiversity that requires social acceptance and social inclusion as much as it does practical support? And will you therefore ensure that this shift in thinking can move across government? And do you accept that this is a basic human right, and to achieve what I have outlined here this afternoon will require legislation, and that nothing will happen with a business as usual approach? And finally, would you agree that non-neurotypical people are best placed to represent and advocate for their neurotype, and that all education and awareness-raising campaigns should ensure that the authentic autistic voice is front and centre of policy formation and service provision through inclusion of members of the rapidly growing neurodiversity self-advocacy movement?
I'd like to thank Leanne Wood for raising a very important dimension. I think it's a dimension in terms of understanding human rights, strengthening equality and human rights, that we obviously now need to look at across government, not just in terms of my portfolio. And interestingly, this did come up last week when Jeremy Miles and I went to the Civic Forum to talk to disabled people about the impact of Brexit. That was the focus, but many issues came forward in terms of impact of policy on disabled people's lives. And of course, I talked again about the social model of disability, which actually this, and some people were here then in 2002, this National Assembly did adopt the social model of disability, but we now, and it's enshrined in the UN Convention on the Rights of Disabled People, but we need to ensure that that now is imbued in all our policy making, and it enables, of course, our Assembly members and committees and disabled people to scrutinise us on the basis of delivering the social model of disability. So the issue that is now you're raising in terms of non-neurotypical people and neurodiversity has got to be clearly addressed. You've raised an important issue, and I think also it's not just an issue that may want to be explored in terms of the Equality and Local Government Community Committee, but the Children and Young People's Education Committee as well, because it is something where there needs to be awareness raised of these issues, but certainly it is something that we need to look at. I hope also that you would consider, Leanne Wood, that the scope that we have in Wales to strengthen equality and human rights is laid out in the statement today. It covers a lot of ground, and we have a great deal to do to safeguard the rights, particularly of disabled people and those who are impacted by the non-neurotypical situations that they find themselves as people, and what that means for their rights. And I hope that we can follow this discussion.